We have welcome to Global Local Politics, whether you're in China, Europe, or Chicago. We're in the midst of multiple global challenges, from the pandemic to the Brexit, European Union connections, to the weekend Washington, D.C. Capitol challenges between President Trump, Nancy Pelosi, the House of Representatives, impeachment, and more. These issues are central to the course in ways that we will try to capture in various ways, but how to do so? Many countries are hit harder by bigger problems. Brazil, where President Bolsonaro has resisted recognition of COVID, but this weekend, people have been on the beaches of Rio de Janeiro, swimming, wearing bathing suits, having fun, no masks. And the president says, COVID is not a big issue. At the same time, this weekend, a leading epidemiologist for Brazil said I see a tsunami coming and thousands will be dead very, very soon. So what we have in Brazil, in a different way, captures what's happening in Washington, what's happening with Brexit, what's happening in China. How make sense of these? For many, the answer is to throw up her hands and say, this is impossible. Just do what you enjoy right now, like crowds on the beach in Rio. We'll consider this as well as an option which many people do follow. And we can't assume that we're all as hardworking, intellectually aware, and politically engaged as you. That is you, we, me. The Hyde Park folks are not quite representative of everybody on the beach in Rio. So both being conscious of how we and these same things do or apply less strongly to us is part of the interpretation, and we should include ourselves in some ways, but where and how to do so in a disciplined manner is what we'll try to do more explicitly in this course. We will challenge a number of the other courses you have had or may be taking, and we'll talk about some of these, for not to be personal or to say something, he's not so good, but why? Why are there differences among courses and interpretations in different books, even by the smartest people around? We'll consider specific events, specific courses, interactions between the global, the national, and down to the very local of the beach and the neighborhood. And we'll bring in various forms of evidence at the same time that we can try to use the evidence to show how much the best analyses do not explain. We'll try, but we recognize that not this course and the best work on many of the topics we'll consider are such that race, class, that is class including income, education, occupation, various status measures, gender, national origin including ethnicity, background, race, and so forth. Even the best analyses of these show that these factors explain roughly about 10 to 15% of most of the social science models about political mobilization, civic participation, and background activities like going to church or to a soccer game. These do not explain everything deterministically. Most of the media and rhetorical discussions by political, civic leaders, talking heads, do not avoid the ideas like multi-causal, probabilistic, and seek instead to have one factor like race and discrimination explain a second factor like the end of democracy. Even a book by Robert Putnam, a smart guy with smart book in some ways, Bowling Alone, engages in some of this. His earlier and later books are much more subtle, and we're closer to those. But we need to see where and why these things are happening. such as using dichotomies in contrast to continuous variables. So instead of saying the end of democracy, we can talk about the degree of democratization, and then use that as a concept to break down and to include, say, egalitarianism, discrimination, and how these link to education or income or travel or cell phone use or other kinds of factors. For the last several years, I've used Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Black Lives Matter, and ISIS as examples that we regularly compare to the best theories about the best social ideas, social science ideas in the course. And one bit of perspective is that this gives us is to see the younger persons who are more cosmopolitan, more connected, like yourselves, connected globally, observing the differences and similarities between ISIS, Black Lives Matter, the storming of the US Congress over this weekend. Younger people, I'm suggesting, around the world have more often seen these, in contrast to many older experts focused on, for instance, the specific historical traditions of the US, invoke the Constitution and precedents, precedents, that is the historical background, which says this is the first time this has ever happened. But if we look at a little more generally some variations of these, we can understand and try to say, not what does one event explain, but how can we deal with the processes that are going on that come together in a weekend or in a particular event. And these middle level processes, these middle level dynamics like voting or protesting, or who do you vote for, or how much of your money and time do you put into this or that? These we can get better when we look not at one nation or one international global COVID, but we can look at more small units and processes and see more. The world and nations are dinosaurs. Local areas are fruit flies. We'll study some of each. With more dramatic and extreme variations at the local level, we can understand the bigger processes better without ignoring them, but having 10 or 20,000 cases instead of one, or say 200 or 300 countries. Countries are too big. The world is too big to say how we can explain it, but if we get down to people on the beach in Rio, we can get closer to some specifics. We'll often cite examples from the US, France, and China. These are great countries because they differ. They have dramatic historical patterns that shift from one another and over time, battling their own pasts in ways that for instance, the US and France both had in different ways what we call a new political culture that we'll talk about. The traditional left and right broke down, with Macron being elected on an almost entirely new party. I mean, people said America has weak parties and Europe, especially France, has very strong political parties. Macron came along and he destroyed basically the Communist Party, the traditional Conservative Party, and others in the middle. And his own new party just a few years ago had a majority in the, I think either plurality or almost a majority in the French National Assembly, in ways that show how fragile that conception of historic, strong French background and strong parties was. The Communist Party in China with Mao had what they called a cultural revolution. The traditional cultural, much of the traditional cultural past, much of the recent Marxist past was fought in the Cultural Revolution. A few years after that, you had an opening up of dramatic markets and transformations with an economy that was more free market oriented. At the same time, the political system was still officially called the Communist Party. These are complicated things that go on within different countries in ways that help us better understand if we get down to a more local level. We're working actively with some Chinese collaborators. One was Carrie Wu, who's already done a survey of Chinese citizens in many of the provinces across China, and he's published a paper in the China Sociological Review showing the degree of trust that different Chinese citizens have in different cities, in their own city leadership, and in their own national leadership. And there are big differences. Guangdong has very low, the region has much lower trust with the national government than do, by contrast, most Chinese citizens trust their national government far more than most of the Europeans or the Americans. Is that because there's a gun at their head? That's what many people from the outside say, but we've gone over about 50 studies of this by people outside of China, and it's very tricky. And one of the best persons on this is Carrie Wu, who co-authored with us some of the material in that we'll be covering in the course. We're also meeting with a group that started at China Scenes Academy in June, and they are continually meeting with people. They launched it with a 4-hour discussion in June of 350,000 participants across China. And we have Scenes Academy meetings where these people are now coming in. Cities are doing the kinds of things we're discussing in this course. Cultural policy is a term that is used more actively in China and in France. You'd barely hear it in the US. But cultural policy includes what a Ministry of Culture does, as well as what propaganda is, and that term is used in a positive, explicit manner by the Central Committee of the Communist Party. People will say, yes, I'm on the propaganda committee, and this is what we ought to be doing. The US counterpart is much more fragmented, much more complicated. We have a constitution which sought to embed this by building on the past before it, but it's there with us now in different ways. So you can have, last summer, Black Lives Matter looting going on in downtown Chicago with the mayor in tears, pleading with people to be more reasonable, at the same time that in Portland, Oregon, the mayor was fighting against troops coming in from the national and state governments, and the mayor himself, I've forgotten what it was tear gassed. So you've got big differences across cities within the US, as well as within China, as well as within France and elsewhere. So the local level can give us more insight. I've lived in Bronzeville most of my adult life. I'm active in African-American groups. I spent the last 6 months also actively working on a report called Bronzeville, Pride and Power and More. And we're actively working on one of the largest projects in Chicago, the replacement of the Michael Reese Hospital site, which was supposed to be the Olympic Village for the Olympics, which they never came. And this is now being actively discussed with residents in Bronzeville. And this grows out of lots of civic activities here, where we can see more subtlety among and within Bronzeville residents. There are lots of differences among African Americans within one neighborhood called Bronzeville, ranging from Baptist ministers to street front preachers to street Muslim activists, Black nationalists, Baptists, and lawyers, bunch of people all over the place, ideologically, politically, and we talk together, and we have co-authored what we can do together to help this development and help the Bronzeville area. Okay. We join these with these specific events and things like the Bronzeville case with the middle level sections of the course on topics like markets, political cultures, new social movements. These are the topics of courses that you have around the university. There are lots of books, there are journals that discuss these. What we do that's new is to join the global, like the pandemic, COVID pandemic, or global markets, or global social media on feminism, or on ISIS recruiting troops to try to go to fight as they did in the past, and as is going on in different ways now in different parts of the world, Indonesia, for instance. We then try to make sense of some of these patterns using some examples where we either have data as well as some historic cases to invoke, which historic cases are often useful because at least they've been around a lot longer than what happened this weekend. But they can inform aspects, not all, but aspects of what's going on in ways that you can bring into and carry around in your heads and say, how well does egalitarianism explain what's on the beach, or individualism, or postmodernism, to move to a more abstract term. Consider some of the biggest global processes. One, the rise of egalitarianism in individual citizen rights. We can link this to 68, but we can, if we look further, we can find, or say I asked a student, I can't avoid citing a case I still love. 68. I had a woman I once asked a class, what do you remember or know from your parents or grandparents about 68? And one woman said, my mother was a protester at Berkeley, and my father was a policeman who was pushing back the protesters as they were trying to demonstrate and go too far. And when he was holding out his hands to try to hold people back, my mother spat in his face. But I was the later product of that marriage. And over the course of their adult lives, they both reversed their ideological positions. How's that for an example? To grow up with that kind of experience and history. So seeing, in a sense, it also illustrates that race, class, gender, national origin, even personal identity when you're 20 or 30 does not predict necessarily what you or your mother and father will say when they're 40 or 50 or 60. And you've now got multidimensional, multicultural images of this in many of your own lives, which I'm sure we'll hear about. We've been talking with several of you over the last few days. But should we go just to 68? Should we go back to 1789, the French Revolution, or to Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Moses, who have generated some of the most widely read works in the world today? The Bible is number one. Yet if the classic ideas still live on, they came from these sources of the ideal Greek and ancient Hebrew society. These two cities, Athens and Jerusalem, were in full form for less than one short century. They didn't last that long. Alexander the Great killed off the Greeks when the Greeks got too involved with other places besides their individual cities. And even within his own lifetime, Socrates, who was consider him the social medium, think of Facebook today, Socrates was simply standing in the agora, the marketplace. Crowds were buying buying fruit and walking by, and he'd say, "Hey, listen, the world is going to collapse. Come and talk to me. Listen." And Socrates had the largest of the crowds, if you will, compared to Plato or Aristotle. But as the crowd was large enough, he became controversial enough that what did the city of Athens do when they said, you're really saying things that are wrong? Socrates was assassinated by the local government. So even the interpreters at the time are engaged in ways that we can ask where and how they may have counterparts around us. The ideals of American democracy, some have said, have failed in the many current debates in the last 4 years in particular. But the one point is to focus on events or actions and then to talk about something like success. Let me make then a second related bigger point. One is that with the rise and increasing application of egalitarian standards and about who does what and who should do what, we have the application of higher, more explicit moral standards that come from the bottom, from the average person, not uniform across an entire nation. They may be very different from one beach, or as I mentioned, one woman who's protesting and her policeman husband in later years. But when Tocqueville came to America trying to identify for the French, what does democracy mean after 1789? What are we going to be like in the future? That's what the French wanted to know. They didn't care about America as a little place over there. They wanted to know about the future of Europe and especially France. What did he see when he saw America? He saw little towns in Massachusetts where people went to church together. And he said, one of the key things we don't have in France is civic engagement, like going to a church and really believing in it. The French today are among the least religious in the world. They're officially Roman Catholic, but almost nobody goes to church. Maybe 20%, mostly elderly women and others, are going to church and say they believe in God and Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, or some related questions. However, in America, not only were there churches, when he looked at the content of what people were doing outside, but influenced by the churches and their moral concerns, and he stressed not just participation. Let me stress that at least in one sentence now. Many, such as Robert Putnam, have said Tocqueville, a one-sentence summary is that Tocqueville is about participation. I would say Tocqueville is about participation and the values and concerns driving that participation of what is moral and right or wrong about the participation. And when he focused on this, his main example in the US at the time was what? Anybody want to suggest what that was? And how it relates to where we are now? What was the number one concern of Americans that Tocqueville wrote about? And it was illustrated by Socrates-like meetings. Public meetings in Boston were the biggest. What were those meetings talking about? And was this in a local government, a city council? No, it was not the government leaders. It was average persons. Were they average persons who could vote like African Americans in the South before 1965? No. Was it like women who couldn't vote in the 19th century? Yes. What were these women in Boston talking about? Women who couldn't vote in 1780, 1790, that Tocqueville said, hey, this is big stuff. Their main theme was abolition. That's all, the only word they needed to use. It was clear to the rest. Abolition of what? Speak up, somebody. Marijuana? No. Abolition of liquor,
Slavery.
maybe, huh?
Slavery.
Slavery, but then after World War I, after women got the vote, what was, okay, so there was, okay, let me not do too many things at once, but the second one was liquor. And did liquor ever get abolished in the US? Soon after women got the vote. Woodrow Wilson was president. Al Capone loved the abolition of liquor. The gangsters had their strongest political impact in Chicago with Big Bill Thompson as mayor. Big Bill got paid off by Al Capone. And all the Hollywood movies tell you about it. And they look at those movies in China and in Thailand and South Africa. Chicago's a famous city, most of all because of Al Capone. Okay, who only existed because of Woodrow Wilson, who because of, okay. So I'm pointing out the ironies and the contrasts which we live with, and that our entertainment, including the Hollywood movies, are part of how we think and remember and conceive of these. And the culture in that sense feeds the general so-called entertainment culture, feeds into the political culture of what's right and wrong and who's moral and who should be murdered or at least tried or impeached. These are with us. This is said forcefully in speeches in public places that racism should be abolished in 1780. And the women of the time wrote books, and they both wrote and sang many of the songs that were important in the 19th century and in World War I. It is said that when Abraham Lincoln first met Louisa May Alcott, why is she famous? Or what did he say? You're the little lady who started the Great War. What did he have in mind?
Did she write Uncle Tom's Cabin?
Righto. That's it. Can the arts, by a non-voting woman, the wife of a college professor at Bowdoin, where I went to college, she wrote that in my dorm when I was a freshman. It was a faculty office at the time. But I'm just saying these kinds of things have defined New England moralism in ways that Daniel Elazar, as we'll read later, say is very different in the American South. So we've got regional differences and city differences. One question I regularly ask is how many of you have lived in the American South more than 5 years? Maybe just raise your hand. Okay, terrific. 5 years ago, almost none of you would be here. The USC College was a heavily, people used to say 10, 20 years ago, this is a New England church combined with a German factory. I said, really? Come on, that goes a little far. But that's one way of labeling the USC entertainment fun tradition. There's more. And the South is one global, one regional difference, regionally distinct part of the US that is closer, that gives us a feel for the rest of the world in the same way that New England shows us how wildly different it was historically. But after 1968, I'm suggesting each of these have come together. There's more of a visible concern with race and ethnic and national relations. In Europe, this was visible in the immigrations in the last, immigration and European into Europe by immigrants has been the hottest issue in Europe for roughly 20 plus years. With Trump, when he made his initial statement about Mexicans are rapists, that got a lot of attention, but that was a huge, dramatic, total violation of American propriety of public discourse and what a presidential candidate should do. That was totally immoral to do by that New England standard. By breaking that standard, Trump has shown things that are sub-differences, subcultural, sub-regional differences within the US that we can better understand by going down to neighborhoods, to cities, regions, and then seeing where they go further in South Africa, in France, in China, where they have more explicit censorship today, as well as explicit propaganda. And we can capture better what propaganda and censorship meant for Karl Marx when in 1848 he wrote the Communist Manifesto. He got kicked out of France, he got kicked out of Germany, etc. Lincoln's comment at least suggests that things like social media discussions can be more important than actions of national political leaders and change the military strategy, as Lincoln waited for years before seriously engaging those Southern troops in the Civil War. The Southern troops were trained. The American South had a tradition of honor, of hierarchy, of responsiveness to a slave holder and leader in ways that meant they would show up with their troops on horses, and they were trained in tactics that the Northern generals and Lincoln himself didn't want to fight with those Southerners. They were better generals, they were better troops. And they waited for years until they had so many numbers, so many guns, so much preparation that it was overwhelming. And the same thing happened in World War I and World War II. The US didn't want to join either of those wars. You know, the war was 2/3 over in World War I when the Americans went in. But when they finally went in, they made a huge visible difference. But it was especially large numbers and a lot of technology, lots of tanks, lots of guns, lots of later on bombing in airplanes and so forth to try to minimize human loss. But the point is, the moral point of this, some people have written the history in terms of commitment and civic engagement, point out that the idea of war implies such a government demand on citizens that you can't, in a populist, semi-populist democracy, ask for people to give their lives unless you've really got them morally committed. That's the classic interpretation of Marty Lipset, Daniel Elazar, Aaron Wildavsky, and so forth, Theda Skocpol. There was one huge exception, Vietnam. Vietnam was a military disaster, a recent general said, not because it was a military defeat at all, but because it was a domestic political disaster that we lost the Vietnam War. Okay, it was a domestic political disaster because it did not have a fundamental support of the citizenry, because there were battles going on inside the US in some ways analogous to what we see with the Biden-Trump election. It was a time of I mentioned 68, and then I'll use 2 or 3 big dates, 3, 4 dates, 1789, 1848, 1968, 1989. The Berlin Wall went down in 1989, and big things changed with globalization. Globalization took off in 1989 with trade, with exchanges, with social media, with students coming here from China in huge numbers, etc. How do we make sense? We consider both the top-down and bottom-up kinds of theories and evidence. So the top-down is especially, we'll see in the first section on markets. And the markets idea of Adam Smith, classic economic views, Wall Street, is also linked by Daniel Elazar in the section on political culture with the Middle Atlantic region, where New York happens to be, and Manhattan or Wall Street happens to be. Donald Trump's, one of his main books is something like Making the Contract. Trump illustrates this highly individualist, so I'm quickly introducing Elazar and 3 types of political culture in the US we'll talk about. New England that I've discussed with the moralism, the South with a sense of honor and hierarchy and slavery. The Middle Atlantic is the market, the Wall Street. But the point is, these three conceptions of America are drastically different. They fight each other. What is moralistic to one is immoral to the other two, if you push them as far as Trump has done, not only in what he's done in the last weeks and 4 years, but in his book. And the bigger point is, he is not alone. If we look at these regional patterns, as people move west from these three regions of the US, they carry their political cultures with them. And so you have a New England moralistic style in parts of upper New York State, through Western Michigan, where there's a strong Dutch fundamentalist tradition, through Wisconsin and Minnesota, all the way out to Washington and Oregon, where in Portland, Oregon, you have a highly moralistic kind of political culture that fits with Bowdoin College, Louisa May Alcott. All right, so these patterns persist in ways that they have also urban counterparts. We have in progress as well a Chicago, New York, Los Angeles debate going on among urbanists. The Chicago School in the 1920s of urban study really was the major urban way of studying many broader processes, but by using cities to do so. And people still are taught this in Chinese universities, or taught it in South Africa and so forth. I came to Chicago in part for this reason, from New York at the time, to join the faculty. The strong Chicago tradition has been challenged by the LA school, so-called, in saying, Chicago's old hat. It's an old European style city. What's new and really fundamental is the freeway, the individual, decentralization. What's in your head as an individual matters, in a sort of combination of Hollywood film combined with a Frankfurt German Marxist style. And so that then you have in a New York version, which tends to be illustrated, for instance, in, we could say, Daniel Bell, Lipset, Glaser, and more recently Sharon Zukin, as an urbanist writing on, and all of them had an explicit background which they called Marxism. And so linking these with an explicit, where and how Marxism does work or works less well is part of the story if we want to see how it's been interpreted, how the same things are interpreted. So Sharon Zukin, for instance, has written papers on how a particular street in New York will have loft living. And so the lofts will illustrate the new artists who are defining Soho as a neighborhood in New York, in the same way that a little street may have bridal gowns or custom shoes and dresses inspired by artists, but how lots of people from suburban areas will come in and shop for wedding outfits there. This is written by a Marxist, and who will say this is the market working through these kinds of innovative consumption practices. Where did consumption come from as part of Marxism? That's a big issue, which China is in the middle of right now. This is a revolution with cultural policy bringing in consumption. Intellectually, this happened probably most powerfully in the person of Walter Benjamin, who wrote on the arcade project about the arcades of Paris, which later on became department stores, which in turn became malls and so forth. But the arcade of Paris showed that when the British built factories, they had smoke in London or surrounding Birmingham, Liverpool, and so forth. These cities were covered with smoke, and people said, and economists, many still say, this was the future. This brought industrial society. This brought the modern world to us. When the French started to build a factory or two outside Paris, people said, stop. We don't want smoke on this pretty city. Industrial Revolution? We don't want the English then, skip it. So Benjamin spent his life, second half of his life, really studying Paris because Paris never industrialized in that way. And Paris is a model for consumption and the consumption economy in ways that we can use in a manner to understand how Chicago and Daly too made many trips to Paris, and you have the boulevards of Chicago. The bus stops in Chicago are glass, and they're both built by and maintained by guys who are part of a French company that go around to make those little bus stops in Chicago look just like the bus stops in Paris. The Chicago boulevard system of the late 19th century was modeled on the Parisian boulevard system. So in that sense, we've got elements of consumption informing different cities. We got a contract with the city of Paris a few years ago to work on our project on scenes with them there. In global competition, we beat the French. So Steve Sawyer and I, we did a book on the cartography of Paris, where we took how the methods we developed in Chicago for neighborhood studies, took it to Paris, 3 years, book published. Then we took that to Seoul, and the Seoul government engaged us again in a competition. We did 2 years of work with the mayor's office of Seoul. Mayor's office of Seoul has a building of about 400 people doing research. Do we have that in Chicago? No. It's called the University of Chicago. Okay. So in that way, and now I mentioned the China scenes activity. That is, we learn from and inform in turn, shift the theories and test the theories with important leading cities around the world. And the shift from production to consumption, the shift from doing things and building factories that are dirty and calling it the modern industrial society, is replaced by a post-industrial society, or places that never had it in the first place, like Paris. So looking at the local level is a way of understanding and finding ways of doing these things that can work out better nationally in different contexts. A related theme I'll just mention now is third, beyond the egalitarianism, beyond the moral standards joined with egalitarianism. A third one, which I paid no attention to in my own work until recently, was the rise of the arts. I did 5 or 6 books on community power. Power was what I was working on. Many people in sociology, most serious social scientists say, arts, that's not social science. One thing that we discovered when Putnam did his book called Bowling Alone, he focused on the theory of Tocqueville, the most common, strong political theory of why and how America works. In doing so, in his book Bowling Alone, he showed basically there's a decline of civic engagement after World War II, and basically said, if the foundation of American democracy is civic local participation in little churches and boys clubs and Boy Scouts and neighborhood organizations, and these are going down, what's going to happen? If we bowl alone, we're going to be such super individualists, so egotistically focused, the whole democratic system will collapse. Okay, some people have taken that for granted and say this is what's happening. But one thing we did with Peter Ochterbird, who came here from the Netherlands for a summer, we reanalyzed the data that Putnam had used, and we found that he was right for most kinds of organizations, except for one in a major way: arts and arts organizations. And so in Achterberg's Netherlands, in the last 25 years or so, where we looked at the data, arts organization activity had tripled. In the US, it had doubled. But people didn't pay any attention to this because these were young people, college students, some of them not college students, but they were in bands. They may have been hip hop bands. And if you look in Bronzeville, you talk to, or Englewood, south of Hyde Park, when we've had students, and as I bike around the city as I've done for years, I've published a paper in a journal called Feminista, called Ethnographic Bicycling. Bike around the city, you can see a lot of things. In Englewood, every second Black teenager guy says, "Hey, you got a camera? Take a video of me. You got a better camera than mine." These are posted by the gangs and by many of those individuals on YouTube. Forrest Stewart, who was an assistant professor here recently, spent about 4 years studying these gangs and the videos they were making as part of Driller Rap, and found that the big gangs, which so marked Chicago 30 years ago, the Rangers and the Disciples, there were two big gangs like the Chicago political machine that so marked Chicago. Today, there are thousands, let's say hundreds. There are hundreds of gangs, but they're making Driller Rap songs and posting them on YouTube, and ways that people gauge their success is not just by turf or by money or sales of drugs or prostitution. They're looking at the YouTube ratings of the individual song or the individual singer or the gang. And the gangs then challenge each other, and sometimes they get killed in reality. However, Forrest found that only about less than 10% of the drillers who were making the videos and singing and recording the songs, only about 10 of them are actually killers. So most of my neighbors are drillers and basketball players, but most of them are not killing anybody. And most people in Bronzeville are just as concerned about security as you are in Hyde Park. But security is another, let me just mention, is an interrelated sense of concern about the moral standards, the local political culture, what the police do or don't do. And in part, the police, this problem was solved by Big Bill Thompson in Bronzeville in the 1920s and 30s by having the police do what? They stayed away. Al Capone and his guys were the main leaders with the big guns. The police stayed out. The police stayed out through lots of neighborhoods across many cities in the US until the last 20 years or so ago. After 1968, with the rise of egalitarianism and the civil rights demands that egalitarianism should be applied to African Americans and women and children, and then later on to animals, and later on to regions, these concerns led to the police having a new theory called the broken windows theory. James Q. Wilson at Harvard wrote it up, and the Boston police chief Bratton tried it out and said, "This is working." Crime went down. He then got hired by New York. New York did the same thing. Crime dropped hugely. So good, he was hired as police chief of LA. So those three cities followed the broken windows theory that security means being tough, frisking, keeping records of people, and having them be fearful of being under surveillance. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Obviously, it's both, and it depends very much on which specific kind of moral perspective you want to follow. But I'm pointing out that inside Bronzeville, people are fighting over, do we want more police and more safety, or do we want more individual freedom to do what you want? Some people are looting. We're looting last summer downtown. Other people were saying, clearly immoral. So there's division among African Americans, just as there is among Hyde Parkers and among students and you and your roommates and people in your houses. People are arguing over these things in ways that don't have simple, clear answers. But if we can understand them better, if we can drill down to smaller cases, areas, and see how they work, and then look at some of the implications, even nationally and globally, as Carrie Wu did already in a published paper for different cities in China. Okay, the book on the reading list, two books feeding into this. One is called Can Tocqueville Karaoke, where we took the Tocqueville theory and we discussed it with Asians, and they said, Tocqueville doesn't work in Asia. We don't have any civic, or I gave a talk to the National Japanese Political Science Association, about 800 people. Then I stayed on for several weeks in Japan, talked with them one by one, said, what's going on? How do you think of these new political developments in Japan? And they said again and again and again, democracy is not an Asian concept, and it's not a Japanese concept. And they would illustrate frequently by saying, traditionally in Japan, if the emperor would go through a village and the village knew that they were beaten down by the state, they would have a petition to the emperor, maybe signed by one or several people in the area. But one farmer would put it into the carriage of the emperor. That person who put it into the carriage would be immediately killed because challenging the emperor meant death. Nevertheless, the emperor would often give the petition to his staff and say, do this, do what they want, but not through majority voting, not through the process of democracy. So what and how populist democracy in a strong state works is a complicated kind of question beyond voting. The Chinese vote for village elections and elect mayors in villages today. They don't vote for the national leaders. What does that mean? Social media become very important. There's a lot of protests and challenges within China. If you have something like a leak or a problem within your your sidewalk, which is broken, you protest. And some studies suggest that these get fixed faster in China than they do in New York or Chicago. A former teaching assistant in this course has a book on do-it-yourself urbanism, where he says, if you're in Chicago or New York, don't try to fix a sidewalk if it's leaking. Get together with some others and put a plank across it yourselves. Do-it-yourself urbanism is also, it's a challenge, it's illegal. It's violating what the local government says we will do. But it's an expression of a strong individualism challenging a strong or not so strong or not so efficient state in ways that these specific processes have counterparts in France and China and the US in different arenas that we can try to trace and see, does this improve trust? See, participation alone, voting alone is not so important unless people will support you. So when Saddam Hussein started to have a battle, I mean, he was feared across the Middle East and so forth, the Israelis, the Iranians, etc. Iraq was scary with this big, etc. He had a battle. What happened in the first battle with Saddam Hussein? The great majority of the troops all went home. They deserted. Saddam Hussein had zero legitimacy. We don't know, zero is an obvious overstatement, but the main troops in battle quit, implying you don't have that's the opposite, at least, of the ideal of the American volunteer, not so volunteered, maybe, military, but that if you don't build a sense of trust, your army can collapse and the nation can collapse, as did Saddam Hussein. So in that sense, these are issues. And so the concept of trust is thus used as an explicit component of legitimacy, but Max Weber introduced the idea of legitimacy to say you don't get trust just from an invasion or from a military. You've got to build with the citizens, and legitimacy is a relationship between the citizens and the leaders. It's not just top down. You've got to have both. And so he had 3 types. What are the 3 types? Somebody. Traditional, doing it the way we've always done it. Bureaucratic, following the state's rules. And charismatic. And charisma he illustrated most with Jesus Christ as in a full book on the Jewish prophets, where he pointed out that Christ was just one example of lots of Jewish prophets. He succeeded most, but that in a lot of battles they had with the Syrians and with the Egyptians and others, the Jews usually lost, but the prophets came out, and they were an integral part of the conception of Judaism and of the Jewish civic culture, Moses being the leader. And so Elazar uses this as a foundation of interpretation of political cultures around the world. I'm covering a lot of things quickly. They may sound confused and contradictory, and some of them are contradictory. That is, we will, in each of the sections, we'll deliberately introduce some contradictions among different theories to show that there's not a simple consensus, but we have smart people saying totally opposed things. And we'll try then to see how can we work this out. So when we went to Asia and we said, do you have civic engagement? And does this enhance trust in China or in Japan? People said, what's civic engagement? What's democracy? So then we continued talking for 4 years. We did these projects with the mayors in Paris and Seoul and so forth. And then we did a book together called Can Tocqueville Karaoke? So Tocqueville is the American civic answer of the little church. Can he, however, karaoke, which is a classic Asian tradition? People in a working factory, in a government agency, in a big restaurant, in a big steel plant, classically in China, Japan, Korea, after work would go to a restaurant, have dinner together, not be with their families, not go home, quote unquote, keep drinking, eating for 2-3 hours. And then after dinner, they would sing karaoke to each other. Does this build legitimacy? Maybe so. Is it more important than going to church together or even spending more time with your own family? We're still studying that right now. But these are the kinds of specific processes of doing karaoke compared to going to church, compared to a new arts activity, where the artists today are often more engaged with what they call, the world or social issues than they are with beauty. So there was a professor at the Art Institute a couple of years ago who gave a talk here and said, let's bring beauty back in, because the artists are talking about race, class, gender, national origin, and age. But this woman was living in Gary, Indiana. She found lots of support and interest and enthusiasm with the residents of heavily African-American city of Gary, who appreciated beauty and aesthetic concern. So the arts interpenetrate these other things in ways that the artists may not be sensitive to as they, so anyway, I'm simply saying faculty at the Art Institute are arguing over these same things among each other. And they're including things which are race, class, gender, and national origin. So we're talking, that is, I'm saying this explicitly in the first class because many of you are not from the arts at all, and this sounds crazy, but to where and how these can bring in the economy. What's the largest corporation and the fastest growing, right now is Apple, but being challenged by Amazon, by Musk. These are super fast growing new corporations, and they're built more on lifestyle and consumption and industrial design than they are just making a cheaper, faster, better machine component, as the old industrial model would imply. 60% of the Chinese economy is basically consumption now. The US in different ways is higher still. Consumption like Facebook, Apple, the big media, the big tech media, these have replaced General Electric. These have replaced the old components of the Dow index. So even the financial pages talk about Facebook and so forth as if they're making widgets. But in fact, this is a very different set of rules, some of which are global, some of which, et cetera. But we will deliberately take on some of these in each of the sections. And so I mentioned the example of the market section where we'll discuss Adam Smith and how his conception of globalization, which was, I'll leave that as a question with you. What was globalization for Adam Smith? What was his term for it? And I'll let you read and think about it. But it's 5:12. We got a little more than 15 minutes. I've been talking. Let's see if we have any questions or discussion. I know it's hard with a bigger group to have. Okay, there we go. There's a hand. And I'm looking. Okay, Mylan Patton, please talk to us.
Yes, sir. Question for you. You mentioned a bit earlier the 3 geographical locations where there's different sorts of culture: the New England area, the economic area, and then of course the South. Where would you characterize the, I guess, the honor of family, or the compassion of family, the embrace of family? Would it be more so the South, or would it be more so the New England area?
Yes, clearly more in the South. But if you take a city like New York, Chicago, or let's just stay with Chicago, people have asked questions, 30 questions that people answer about themselves, such as how important is your family, and then more subtle variations of that. How much do you talk to friends? How much do you believe in doing things alone more important than doing them with friends? A bunch of questions like that, where they've measured this by neighborhood. So we've got measures for every zip code in the US of those kinds of dimensions, honor. And the south and west sides of Chicago have got a higher sense of honor and of helping people out than does the north side or Hyde Park. Those, in terms of the so-called Big Five psychological theories of today, score highest on the north side on neuroticism. That's the psychologist's dimension for the north side. So yes is the answer. But it's more complicated than just those regions when you get things like different neighborhoods. And this is a reason for going down to individual neighborhoods and for contrasting them within Chicago, and then riding your bike and seeing how different people are in different Chicago neighborhoods. And you can see a lot. Did you have any follow-up on that, or is that enough of an answer for now?
No follow-up. Thank you.
Okay. All right, here we have Ethan King.
Yeah, in terms of what you just said, how much do you think, like, in terms of like the polling and the psychological kind of analysis of different neighborhoods in Chicago specifically, how much do you think that translates to kind of local or federal politics in terms of elected officials and stuff?
That's the reason that I've studied cities, because I wanted to answer the big global questions from the beginning, from Aristotle and so forth, and Marx. But when I tried to do so and talk to people at the national level, it became too messy. They lied, you couldn't get the data. So I started studying and looked at people who'd done the best books on this. And one of the best was by Robert Dahl, called Who Governs, which is on our reading list. And basically, and as he said there, Athens was about the same size as New Haven. And so if you go down to smaller areas, and we've taken it one step further, as I mentioned with Bronzeville, if we go to the neighborhood level, the place area, we can often understand these bigger processes better than if we do the nation. So yes, on the other hand, the best polling data are only for national samples of 1,500 people. So we don't have neighborhood serious surveys. So we tend to have more ethnography, we tend to have more rough data, but it's also increasingly big data. So you can get big rough data about leaking of faucets, or of something like that, or percent or numbers of complaints for leaks in my street. And those kinds of things we're now getting cities even publishing by neighborhoods and so forth, or the percentage of, or the number of grocery stores, et cetera, places to eat, or liquor stores. So these become valuable data for trying to capture more general values and lifestyle, along with, and so basically I'm a supporter of all kinds of methods. Every method it can be. All methods are created equal, at least, and how we use them is the key. And I'm adding that some of the smartest, most rigorous social scientists, the economist James Heckman, Nobel Prize, is more heavily cited even than Gary Becker, but Becker and Heckman use multiple methods, multiple ways of thinking, and bringing in theories from these different perspectives in ways that come from the New York Times, as well as the American Journal of Sociology. So we have an increasing interpenetration of the social sciences by the smartest people, I'd say, such as Heckman and Becker. And I would say the discipline of economics has got more cutting edge fragmentation, writing about amenities, lifestyle, consumption, whereas many of the sociologists will still say money is all you need to know about, or money plus race and gender. But if you look more closely and look at the evidence, look at any of the journals in all these fields, look for what's called the adjusted R squared. And it's usually about 10 to 15%, which is to say 80% of what we're studying in most of the journals is unexplained. So this says we need room for other things to put these things together beyond the simple. So I'm not saying that social science theories are bad. I'm simply saying the context is limited. And that's in the same sense that the title of our book, Kentuckville Karaoke, is not to say that karaoke is the answer, but is to say that maybe the arts in a particular context linked with the job and with duty and hierarchy can build legitimacy in ways that doesn't work in Chicago. It does work in Seoul or Beijing in ways that it fails in London. And so having a sensitivity and adding, just a quick general point, add the context and the scene, as we call it, to the propositions, and we can build a much stronger theory than if we just say, does money increase happiness? The answer is, as the economists are now studying happiness more than anybody else, and they say, money does a little bit, but social relations do a lot more. Being in a family, having friends, having a significant other, and African-American women who are not married have often closer ties with their sisters, their aunts, their grandmothers, who take care of kids, who say, help me out. They do in ways that the degree of those personal relations can be just as important as having a husband. So social relations are critical, but marriage per se is not. mean, that's a challenge, but that's a simple empirical finding in a sense. More questions from anybody outside? How many of you are from outside the U.S.? We can't see everybody, but maybe raise your hand. Let me see. I guess there's a few. Well, we're not set up to easily do the hand. Well, I don't know. Maybe Michael can do that. If not, let's not try to do that as a vote. But okay, Matt Zhao. There we go. Matt, you want to comment on anything about coming? That is, I like the sound of that name. Do you have a video you can turn on, Matt? If that's okay with you? All right. Yeah, a lot of light right behind you. Is there a way to have the light be a little more on you and less just from behind? That's better.
Is this better?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, go ahead. Any reaction to what I said about? Are you in China or from China?
Well, I am from China, but I'm currently in the state.
Okay, great. Any comments on anything I said on China, for instance?
I thought I think your comment about the civil part, like the general public participating in government affair, that's very interesting to me, and kind of the importance of social media in the Asian country, because that kind of echoed a lot with my experience. So like the like Weibo, like the Chinese kind of equivalent of like Facebook and Twitter, people who have a large following on Weibo tend to have lots of not political power, but a lot of say or a lot of influence over the general just general how people react to certain news. So for instance, like if some person is treated unfairly in the legal system, or there was like a questionable treatment in the judicial branch, then if people complains on Weibo and gets lots of following on this trend, and people start talking about it, now the problem tends to get fixed relatively quickly in comparison to going through complaints through a normal route. So I think that's a very interesting point you mentioned.
Yeah, say just for the others, when you say on normal grounds, I think you mean such as going in Chicago to your precinct captain traditionally, or in an American proper town that is not going up through the Democratic Party and the precinct captain in the Irish Catholic style, but instead going to your city council member, or more properly in terms of the bureaucratic legitimacy of the Prussian Weberian background, calling your ward, or calling your police department, or calling your sanitation department and having them fix it, and or having them not fix it, which has led to these alternatives. So my quick point is, I mean, I've been amazed at seeing and hearing what you just described of the degree to which and so the Chinese national, provincial, and local governments have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of their staffs monitoring, and they're not just trying to censor, they're trying to do things like fix potholes. But that doesn't mean that people vote for the president. So these different dimensions of participation are tricky and interesting to explore.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for that comment. Anyone else from outside the US who wants to comment on any of this? Anybody from France, for example? Or any other country? I can't see all of your, or either easily scroll, but if anybody wants to speak up. Okay. All right, then within.
Professor, sorry. I think Max had a question.
Max, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just curious how exactly you would define like civic engagement, civic activities, what kind of falls into that, and if that would now include things.
civic engagement is something we'll talk about. And I mean, exactly, your question is what we asked at the beginning of this book. And that it's problematic because in the US, it's often called nonprofits. That if you're not trying to make money, and you're then a church, you're something like that. But in China, everybody's sort of a nonprofit in the sense that, or put differently, people talk about the social sector or social services. So the word, and in France, it's different still. There's a sense of distrust. That is the tradition of the positive engagement, the legitimacy growing out of the little Massachusetts church, which Tocqueville described. He also said in another book, France is the opposite. The citizens don't trust. And that carries on right up to today. The major traditions of the types of organizations, of civic organizations in France, are monitoring and checking up on the state. So the types of organizations and even their names, and the fact that these were illegal in France through the whole 19th century. And in China today, most of these, practically all these, have to have some linkage, which also means someone who can pass on information about what you're doing if you say you're the head of an environmental organization in one city. These have been such that they've been very cautious, and some of the, and so we had a student who did a PhD on environmental organizations in China, and found, for instance, that often the environmental organization would not want to lead any kind of protest because they could be quit, they could be X'd. Okay, so censorship and government controls interpenetrate these things in complicated ways. But we get, I'd say, I'll try in general not to spend too much time on definitions, but we focus more in the course on propositions like X causes Y causes Z, and then says, where and why is there about, and the philosophers of science will talk about, say, well, this assumes. Rather than saying assume, we'll try to say, and not as the economists will say, ceteris paribus, we'll try to say, in what countries or what contexts, what neighborhoods is X leads to Y leads to Z, such as participation leads to election of leaders, leads to more trust of citizens. Where is that strong or weak or zero or even negative? Anybody think of an example where it might be negative? I'll leave you to think about that one, and we'll be talking about that. How it can be the opposite of the normal Boy Scout or the extracurricular. I mean, many people told you, oh, if you want to go to a good college, you got to be president of civic organizations in your high school, join the civic organizations and be a leader. Then people will know that you ought to come to good college. Okay, lots of people, I'm sure. How many were told, how many of you ever heard that before? Okay, lots. All right. So where and how and why that actually holds, and does that hold in France or in China? It's different, etc. The other thing I often ask when we talk is, and I talk to myself and ask others, what city or region or neighborhood in the US are you from? And then try to link that, if we can, with either your support of or reaction against it. So let me ask Natalia Medina, what city and neighborhood are you from?
I'm from a suburb in Chicago called Palatine, so about an hour northwest of the city.
Okay, terrific. We had a woman last quarter. I asked that same question. Said, "Oh, I'm from a suburb of Chicago," just to sort of something. Right then, I went on a little more, and it's right near the Argonne National Laboratory, and it's something more there. And said, well, yes, both of her parents were PhD physicists. Do you have two parents who are PhD physicists?
No, neither of my parents are.
Okay, I'm just saying, follow-up questions are, I don't mean to put anybody on the spot, except to say, having individual variations as you talk to people in your own houses or as you talk online, as you get to know each other, talking to your fellow students is a valuable part of your education here, and we'll try to facilitate it by bringing out some of this discussion right here so you can follow up and even do, as has happened in frequent courses last year, 2 or 3 of you may find a common interest and may want to do a memo or even a little paper together. So we had 3 guys who did a paper on sports and sports teams, and they didn't know each other at all before we had this kind of discussion in the class, and it was a terrific paper. So we'll end on that, and we'll continue on Wednesday. And we're getting more stuff set up. We're going to get more detail and update of the syllabus. So don't take the syllabus as final. Take it still as preliminary, but start reading anything more generally, scanning through based on what I've said here. And and the first section, of course, is Adam Smith and et cetera. But we're probably going to move the social media section ahead and bring in some of that because that's so important for some of the examples, as you've heard me talk about today. Okay, that's the, oh yeah, we'll have office hours normally on Mondays, sometimes on Wednesdays, but right after classes. Stay tuned, stay right here, stay on Zoom, and we can have office hours. Otherwise, we'll see you Wednesday. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor,
Yes.
can I ask about, I'm a senior, I'm graduating this quarter. And so I know our grades are due a little bit earlier. And so I just wanted to check in and see if there's anything we need to do specifically, like to fill out anything or just.
No, that's standard. We expect to have graduates every quarter. And we probably have an earlier exam as an option, because most people want to do an exam. So if you want to do a paper, a big paper, we can talk about that, but normally we'll probably have an earlier exam.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
No problem. Let's see. Kyle Lee. Are you there? No. Okay, Kira Hill. Okay. Kira that's Kyle Lee just hung up. Kira Hill, do you have anything you wanted to talk about?
I just had a question about, I did go through the syllabus, but I was wondering what the memos are specifically, and whether or not we have to, because I looked on Canvas and I looked at the format of the memos. Do we have to answer those questions?
No, anything you want.
Oh, so
just read the text of the syllabus a little more closely, and it says you can write a memo on any topic, and you can post it and send it to, and then we'll often ask you to, that is, you can participate by coming to class and talking as we have today, or writing memos, sort of said, and a memo can be a half a page or a page. If it's a good idea, few lines is enough. If it can be 2 or 3 pages as well. It could be done with someone else. If you want to work on sports and do some data analysis, and someone has a computer and someone has a knowledge of the sports teams, you can put those together for instance, as these 3 people did. So the topic is wide open, and it's a way to participate and to engage and try things out.
okay, thank you so much.
Very good. Mylan, thank you for your comment. Do you have anything you want to talk about further now?
Thank you, Professor Clark. I do. I sent you a message, and I was not sure whether my question fell
Just now, should I look at it here, or where'd you send it?
Via the Zoom private message. And I wanted to ask,
Under chat. Okay, yeah, here we go. I've already asked a question and did not want to intervene. How have rural communities pushed back against this globalization and great change of the community and local politics? Really curious about this, particularly as the influence of technology in our, okay. Terrific question. mean, and one big way to answer that is to say not all rural areas and not all nations, but to look at different rural areas and different nations and ask and re-ask the same question. And it's a great way to try to show, for instance, that in the US, we've got a lot of national, international culture in the rural areas. So you have, and plus your second point, technology, fancy technology. You have high-tech farmers in the US who have machines, that automatically measure each little foot as they're planting fertilizer. And if the front of the tractor finds that there's not enough fertilizer here, the back of the truck drops more fertilizer. I mean, that's fancy, fancy stuff.
That is true.
So you've got that kind of very high tech, and you can have farmers who are buying and selling, futures on the options exchange based on what they think the market's going to do, either in general or if they're growing wheat, they can talk about wheat in ways because they have local knowledge that the Wall Street people may not, and so forth. Third is things like telephones and now social media and Facebook and just cell phones. Something like 70% of Chinese are connected to each other through cell phones. Chinese. So people used to say 5 and 10 years ago, oh, the poor people don't have any connection. Like hell. Young African-American men and young African-Americans in the US in general do cell phone and media kinds of connections at twice the rate of their white counterparts. So young African-American men are very connected. They don't go to the Baptist church with their mothers. They may not know who their fathers are, but they're connected in different ways that are twice the rate of whites.
So it's more complex.
More complex, yeah. So life is complex and so Forrest Stewart has a book called The Ballad of the Bullet about these gangs, and I cited that, but the book's been out a couple of months. And he and I used to bike around Chicago and talk about these things, stop in different neighborhoods, talk to people, and they're great themes.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the course. I won't take up any more of your time.
No problem. Okay. Hello? Is this part of the course or? Hello? No, okay, so. Yeah, is this part of the course or who's calling, please? Who's calling, please?